Back then, I thought it was just a phrase from a very sensitive young man. Carlo had this way of saying things with a serenity that disarmed any adult, you know? We shared a room, lived through those moments of silence before sleep, and suddenly he'd drop something that seemed simple, but kept echoing. I'd listen, half distracted sometimes, thinking about the next day's tasks, about church commitments, about that sermon the pastor had given at the service. Carlo was different from the other young Christians I knew. He didn't talk about faith like someone reciting memorized Bible verses, but like someone who truly saw something I couldn't perceive. It was as if he had a special camera to capture invisible details of spiritual life, while I looked at everything through lenses fogged up by the daily grind. I remember that specific day, while we were packing our backpacks to go to the Bible study with the youth group, he stopped, looked at me with those clear eyes and said that. It wasn't something elaborate, didn't have complicated theology or the language of an experienced pastor. It was just his observation, maybe even naive to my ears as someone who thought he understood Christianity. I laughed lightly, gave him a pat on the shoulder and commented that he thought too much about things, that he needed to relax a bit and enjoy his youth. But the truth is that phrase stayed there, like a note stuck on the refrigerator of memory, waiting for the right moment to make sense. Carlo didn't insist, didn't try to convince me of anything. He simply smiled in that calm way of his, and we headed to the prayer meeting we had that night. What I didn't know is that those words carried a weight that only time would reveal. In the hustle of routine, between morning worship songs, conversations about the gospel and the testimonies of faith we heard at church, I let that phrase from Carlo settle way back in my mind. It didn't shout, didn't demand immediate attention. It was like a seed planted in fertile soil that hadn't yet received the necessary rain to germinate. Carlo remained himself, always with a book under his arm, always connected to that dimension of spirituality that seemed as natural to him as breathing. And I remained myself, practical, rational, that kind of person who needs to see to believe, who likes to keep his feet on the ground even when talking about religion. But something was preparing itself behind the scenes of life, something that would completely transform my understanding of worship, of divine presence, of what it really means to live faith day to day. After he departed, those words began to haunt me. It wasn't something I chose to remember. They simply appeared in the most unexpected moments, like those songs that get stuck in your head without you knowing why. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and the empty room screamed his absence in a way I never imagined possible. The silence was no longer that peaceful space before sleep where Carlo would drop his deep reflections. Now it was a dense, almost palpable void that reminded me that something fundamental had been ripped from my life. I tried to fill that void with the usual things. Went to church, participated in services, sang the same worship hymns. But everything seemed mechanical, as if I were playing a role in a play where I'd forgotten the script. Saudade is a word that takes on a completely different meaning when you lose someone like this. It's not just missing them, it's a physical pain that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. I tried to pray like Carlo had taught me, sought comfort in the Bible, reread the passages he underlined in his daily devotional, but the words seemed like dead letters on a page, without the breath he gave them when he commented on them. At the gatherings with the young Christians in the group, everyone looked at me with that uncomfortable compassion of those who don't know what to say, offering canned phrases about God's plan and eternal life that, though well-intentioned, didn't reach the place where it truly hurt. And that phrase, that damn phrase he'd dropped months before departing, remained there, floating in my mind like a riddle I refused to solve. There were days when anger mixed with sadness in a way that scared me. I'd get angry with God in my nightly prayers, questioning why he had allowed a young man with so much spirituality, with so much to offer to Christianity and religion, to leave so soon. I'd attend Sunday sermons and felt as if the pastor was speaking a foreign language, the words about hope, about divine purpose, about the Lord's mysterious ways, all bounced off the surface of my pain without managing to penetrate. Other people's testimonies of faith at the service irritated me, not because they were false, but because I could no longer connect with that dimension where faith brings immediate peace. Carlo had left, taking with him that light I didn't even know I needed so much. And now here I was, stumbling in the darkness, clinging to a phrase he'd said so naturally that I'd almost completely ignored it at the time. I began to perceive signs where before I saw only coincidences. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. That was my nature, wasn't it? When I'd find one of the books Carlo read about Bible studies open to exactly the page I needed to read that day, I thought it was coincidence. When a worship song he used to sing would start playing on the radio, just when I was going through a difficult moment, I'd tell myself it was simple probability. But the coincidences began to accumulate in a way that even my skeptical mind started to question. It was as if someone was leaving breadcrumbs in a dark forest, guiding me toward some place I still didn't understand, but that my heart was beginning to sense. There was a specific moment that marked a turning point. I was at church, at one of those midweek services that Carlo never missed, feeling that mix of obligation and desperate search for comfort. The pastor was talking about how Jesus Christ communicates with us in subtle ways, how spirituality doesn't always come with thunder and lightning, but with soft whispers that require attentive ears. And right at that moment, a lady I'd never seen before sat next to me and said, without any context, "Your friend wants you to know you're not alone." I froze. I hadn't told anyone at church about Carlo at that level of detail, and certainly not this unknown woman. When I turned to ask her how she knew, she was already gone, and no one else seemed to have seen her sit beside me. Those small events began to weave a network of comfort that my reason tried to dismantle, but that my heart desperately needed to believe. I started paying more attention to moments of prayer, to really listening instead of just talking. In my morning devotional, Bible passages I'd read hundreds of times suddenly took on new meaning, as if someone had turned on a light in a room I thought I knew in the dark. The testimonies of faith in the young Christians group no longer irritated me. Now I listened to them looking for clues, looking for patterns of how God works amid pain. And that phrase from Carlo, which before haunted me like an annoying ghost, began to transform into something different. A key that I still didn't know which lock to insert it into, but that I carried with the growing certainty that it would open something important. Then I understood. That really was impossible to ignore. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, one of those that promises nothing special, when something happened that split my life into a before and after. I was organizing Carlo's things that I'd stored in boxes, a task I'd postponed for months because it hurt too much to face it. Among his belongings, I found his prayer journal, that worn notebook where he noted his conversations with God as if it were the record of an intimate friendship. I began reading it with tears in my eyes, feeling his presence in every word written in that characteristic handwriting of his. And then, in an entry dated exactly 6 months before his departure, I found something that left me breathless. He had written textually about an event that was occurring in my life at that precise moment, with details so specific that it was statistically impossible for it to be coincidence. But that wasn't all that shook me to my foundations. On that same page, Carlo had drawn something, a small sketch of a scene I recognized immediately because it had happened the previous week. It was the exact moment when I'd decided to return to church after months of staying away, represented with so many precise details that it made me question all my notions about time, space, and reality. How could he have known? How could he have captured that moment with such accuracy months before it happened? My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps I was remembering it wrong. Perhaps the dates were mistaken. Perhaps it was just my desperate need to find meaning, creating connections where there were none. But there was something more on that page, a note in the margin that said, "When you find this, you'll know it was impossible to ignore. I was always seeing what you couldn't see yet." I left the house almost running, with the journal pressed against my chest, and went directly to find the pastor who had known Carlo. I needed someone else to see this, to confirm I wasn't going crazy, that what I was experiencing had some kind of external validation. The pastor read the pages with that expression of someone who has seen things that defy logic, but recognizes as genuinely spiritual. He spoke to me about the gifts of the Spirit, about how some young Christians have a connection with the divine dimension that transcends our ordinary understanding, about how the gospel is full of stories where the veil between heaven and earth becomes translucent for certain specially tuned souls. But more than his theological words, it was his look that convinced me. That look of recognition, as if he were confirming something he himself had suspected about Carlo all that time. That night, in my prayer before sleep, I no longer spoke to God as someone demanding answers, but as someone who finally begins to understand that there are questions whose answers come in a completely different language than we're used to. My son saw with the eyes of faith what I only saw with those of reason. Sorry, sometimes I still get confused with languages when the heart speaks louder than the head. My roommate saw with the eyes of faith what I only saw with those of reason. That was the revelation that fell upon me like a curtain being drawn in a dark room, letting in a light that had been there all along, but that I'd refused to see. Carlo wasn't especially mystical or detached from reality. On the contrary, he was probably the most connected person to what's real that I'd ever known. The difference is that his definition of real included dimensions that my practical rationalism had classified as optional, as pretty ornaments of religion, but not its true substance. He lived Christianity not as a philosophy or moral code, but as an active relationship with something, with someone, who was constantly communicating, constantly present, constantly working in the invisible details of existence. I began to review all our past conversations with this new lens of understanding. Those times he talked about feeling the presence of Jesus Christ in everyday moments, while having breakfast, while studying, while walking down the street. I had interpreted them as poetic expressions of a sensitive young man. I never considered that he was describing experiences as real to him as the touch of a table or the taste of coffee. His comments about Bible studies weren't intellectual exercises. They were maps he used to navigate territory I didn't even know existed. When he talked about worship at church, he wasn't just referring to singing worship songs. He was referring to a state of attunement with the divine that transformed every act, every thought, every breath into a form of living prayer. And that phrase he'd said to me, "This is impossible to ignore," wasn't a prediction or a warning. It was simply the description of his constant experience, living in a world where God's signs were as evident as traffic signs on a highway. What impacted me most was understanding that Carlo wasn't trying to convince me of anything when he shared these things. It wasn't a sermon disguised as casual conversation. It wasn't an attempt to seem more spiritual than the other young Christians in the group. It was simply radical honesty. He shared his experience of spirituality, the same way I shared my experience of football or work. For him, talking about his morning devotional was as natural as me talking about my exercise routine. Faith wasn't a separate compartment of his life that he activated on Sundays at the service. It was the operating system on which everything else ran. And now, with that journal in my hands, with those coincidences accumulating until they formed an undeniable pattern, with that phrase resonating with a completely new meaning, I was finally beginning to understand that perhaps, just perhaps, I had been looking at reality with only one eye open, when all along there were two available to use. Even after departing, Carlo continues to teach. Not in that metaphorical and consoling way people usually say at funerals. He'll always live in our hearts, or his legacy endures in our memories. No, this was different. It was more concrete, more active, more disturbing to my old way of understanding how the world works. Small things began to happen that were impossible to attribute only to my grief-overloaded imagination. Books that fell from shelves opening exactly to the page I needed to read that day. Unknown people who approached me at church with messages that answered questions I'd only formulated in my private prayer the night before. Dreams where Carlo appeared not as a diffuse memory, but with photographic clarity, transmitting specific things to me that later confirmed themselves in physical reality with chilling precision. It was as if he'd moved on to operate from a different place, but with a freedom of movement and a capacity for intervention that he didn't have when limited by a physical body. At first, I tried to hide these experiences from other people for fear they'd think I was losing my sanity. But when I finally dared to share them in the Young Christians group, I discovered I wasn't the only one. There were others who had also experienced those subtle interventions. A girl who had found a medal Carlo had given her years ago just when she was considering abandoning the faith. A guy who had heard Carlo's voice in his mind during a moment of grave temptation, saving him from making a disastrous decision. Entire families who reported unmistakable signs of his active presence in critical moments. They weren't spectacular phenomena worthy of appearing on sensationalist programs. They were discreet but unmistakable touches, like the signature of an artist who knows the value of subtlety. The pastor, with his decades of experience in ministry, explained to me that this is what Christian tradition calls the communion of saints. That invisible network, where those who have departed continue interceding, guiding, accompanying those of us who still walk in this temporal dimension. The most extraordinary thing was discovering that Carlo seemed to have a specific agenda in these interventions. He didn't manifest randomly or to impress. There was always a pedagogical purpose, as if he continued being my roommate, but now with privileged access to information about the challenges I would face. When I was about to make an important decision about my career, I found a letter he had written me years ago, and that I'd completely forgotten, where he discussed exactly that dilemma with a depth that only now made sense. When I went through a crisis of faith after a tragedy in the community, I dreamed of him sitting in our old room explaining to me with that characteristic patience of his why suffering doesn't contradict God's love. And always, it came back to that phrase, "This is impossible to ignore." Now I understood it didn't just refer to divine signs in life. It referred to him, to his continued presence, to that reality that death isn't the end of significant relationships, but merely a change of frequency in the same eternal conversation. Our house learned to live that truth. And when I say our house, I don't just mean the physical space where we lived, but that complete ecosystem of relationships, routines, and beliefs that defines what we call home. Something fundamental changed in how we related to spirituality. It was no longer that set of rituals we fulfilled out of cultural obligation or family tradition, but a living conversation that permeated every corner of everyday existence. The morning devotional stopped being that quick Bible reading before rushing off to work. It transformed into a genuine moment of listening, where we waited, really waited, for something to communicate with us. Prayers before meals were no longer automatic formulas repeated from memory, but authentic thanksgiving charged with awareness that every detail of life is a gift we could easily be ignoring. The most notable transformation was in how we began to talk about faith among ourselves. Before, conversations about religion were formal, almost ceremonial. We'd comment on Sunday's sermon, discuss some point from the Young Christians group Bible study, but always with that safe distance that keeps things on the abstract plane. Now there was a new vulnerability, a willingness to share direct experiences of how we felt the divine presence, or how we struggled with doubt. My mother began telling us about small, everyday miracles she'd always experienced, but had never verbalized for fear of seeming superstitious. My father, that practical man who had always kept Christianity in the Sunday compartment, began talking about how he felt the guidance of the gospel in his business decisions, in his work relationships, in those gray ethical moments where principles are put to the test. The church where we went also noticed the change. It's not that we became fanatics, or those uncomfortable Christians who try to convert everyone at every moment. It was something more subtle, but deeper. There was a different quality in our participation in services, in our way of singing worship hymns, in how we listened to other people's testimonies of faith. It was as if Carlo, through his departure and continued presence, had taught us to tune into a frequency that had always been broadcasting, but that our internal receivers had never adequately captured. The pastor commented to me privately that he could see a spiritual gravity in our family that wasn't there before. Not in the sense of sad seriousness, but in the sense of real weight, of substance, of people who have touched something true and can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. And all because that sensitive young man who shared my room had lived that truth so naturally that, even in his physical absence, he kept teaching us how it's really possible to inhabit reality with both eyes open. What was impossible to ignore, today reaches the whole world. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. What began as a phrase uttered in the intimacy of a shared room between two young men now resonates on continents Carlo never physically visited. His story began to expand in that organic way that genuinely powerful things have, without need for advertising campaigns or ecclesiastical marketing strategies. A testimony shared at a service became a conversation that someone took to another young Christians group, which in turn mentioned it at a spirituality retreat, which inspired someone to write about it, and so the domino effect multiplied to proportions none of us anticipated. What's extraordinary is that it's not the story of a spectacular miracle that captures people's attention. It's precisely that quality of faith lived naturally, that integration of the divine into the everyday that Carlo exemplified so perfectly. I began receiving messages from people I'd never met, families from Spain, from Mexico, from Brazil, from Argentina, telling me how Carlo's story had touched their own lives. A mother wrote to me about how the testimony had helped her process the loss of her own son, allowing her to see beyond the immediate pain toward that dimension of continuity that Carlo had lived so consciously. A group of theology students contacted me because they were doing their thesis on how young people today experience Christianity in different ways than previous generations, and they saw in Carlo a paradigmatic example of that authentic spirituality that seeks real connection rather than religious conformity. Pastors from different denominations began using elements of his story in their sermons, not as pious legend, but as concrete example of how the gospel can be lived with total naturalness in the 21st century, without seeming anachronistic or disconnected from contemporary reality. What excites me most is seeing how his way of living religion is inspiring especially young people, that generation that so many say is lost to faith, that's no longer interested in church, that finds traditional worship boring and irrelevant. It turns out that what many young people reject isn't Jesus Christ or the substance of the Christian message. It's the packaged, institutionalized, disconnected from vital experience version we sometimes offer them. Carlo shows them something different, that it's possible to be deeply spiritual without being weird, that you can live an intense devotional life without disconnecting from contemporary culture, that the Bible can be as relevant for navigating the complexities of the modern world as any best-selling self-help manual. His legacy isn't a set of rules or doctrines. It's a living invitation to experience that dimension of reality he could never ignore, and that now, thanks to his testimony, thousands of people are learning to perceive as well. Perhaps you're also ignoring something God is trying to show you. I don't say this as judgment, or as one of those religious phrases that sounds nice but empty. I say it from the other side of a process that split me in half and recomposed me in a completely different form. I know what it's like to be so consumed by pain that divine signs seem like cruel insults, as if someone offered you a candy when what you need is for them to return the person you lost. I went through those months where the idea of divine purpose enraged me, where other people's testimonies of faith sounded like unbearable white noise, where the most heartfelt prayers bounced off the ceiling without seeming to reach any meaningful destination. And precisely because I've been there, in that dark valley where spirituality seems like the universe's biggest mockery, I can tell you with total honesty, there's something real on the other side of that pain. Something that doesn't cancel or minimize it, but gives it a completely different context. Look around you with new eyes. Those small details you dismiss as coincidences, those intuitions you stifle with defensive rationalism, those moments where you feel a gentle touch on your heart that you quickly classify as passing emotion. What if they're not? What if they're exactly what they seem to be? Attempts at communication from that dimension Carlo navigated so easily, and that we, with our practical materialism, have trained our senses to filter out as irrelevant noise. I'm not suggesting you become credulous before any sensation, or that you abandon critical thinking. Carlo never did that. But there's a difference between healthy skepticism and defensive cynicism that closes us off to experiences that could completely transform us. When you read the Bible, do you do it truly expecting to hear something? Or is it just a cultural habit you fulfill without real expectation? When you go to the service at church, Do you participate in worship with genuine openness to being touched by something greater than you? Or is it a social ritual you execute on autopilot? For families going through losses, through crises, through those moments where faith seems like a luxury they can no longer afford, I have to tell you something I learned the hardest way. Christianity isn't an insurance policy against suffering. It's a map to navigate it without losing your humanity in the process. Carlo never promised me that believing in Jesus Christ would protect me from pain. What he showed me, with his life and now with his continued presence, is that there's a way to go through that pain where you're not alone, where there's meaning even in what seems most absurd, where death itself doesn't have the last word. The Bible studies in the Young Christians group, that morning devotional that seems so irrelevant when you're bleeding inside, that church community that sometimes irritates you with its unconscious joy. All those elements you dismiss when pain tightens are precisely the threads that keep you connected to something greater than your personal tragedy. And yes, you might hate me right now for saying this. These words might seem like the ultimate insensitivity from someone who's already crossed to the other side of grief. But keep them, like I unknowingly kept that phrase from Carlo, because the day will come, and it will come, where you'll remember that someone told you there's real hope on the other side of this, and perhaps then you'll be ready to consider it. Only now do I understand. And this has changed everything. Years have passed since that night when Carlo dropped that phrase in our shared room. Years of a journey that took me from comfortable skepticism to a place of constant amazement at how the divine interweaves with the ordinary. The silence no longer frightens me like before. Now I recognize it as the space where the most important voices whisper, where the deepest truths reveal themselves not with fanfare, but with that stillness that requires all our attention to be captured. I've learned that faith isn't the absence of doubts or the arrogant certainty of someone who has all the answers. It's the willingness to remain open to a reality broader than our mental categories, to a presence more subtle than our physical senses normally detect, to a conversation that's been unfolding all along, though we arrive late to it. The spiritual maturation Carlo forced me to undertake wasn't what I expected. I didn't become that Christian who has prefabricated answers for all existential questions, or that kind of believer who walks around with a permanent smile proclaiming that everything's wonderful because God has a plan. I became someone more comfortable with mystery, more willing to live in that tension between what I can explain and what I can only experience, more aware that the Bible isn't an instruction manual, but a record of how others before us navigated this same tension. Prayers changed in nature. They're no longer lists of petitions presented to a cosmic manager, but genuine conversations where sometimes I speak, sometimes I listen, and often I simply remain present in that silence charged with meaning that Carlo knew so well. Worship at services, the gospel preached from the pulpit, the testimonies of faith shared in the Young Christians group. Everything takes on a different depth when you stop evaluating it with criteria of entertainment or practical utility and begin experiencing it as invitations to touch that dimension that was always there waiting for us. The final certainty I've reached, and I use the word certainty with full intention, is that God speaks softly, but never in vain. Every whisper has a destination. Every sign has purpose. Every gentle touch on the heart is an invitation to go deeper into that relationship that defines everything else. Carlo knew it, lived it, and now from wherever he is, continues teaching it to me with infinite patience. That phrase he uttered so many years ago, "This is impossible to ignore," has become the perfect summary of my spiritual experience. Once your eyes open to this dimension of reality, once you experience even a glimpse of that constant presence that permeates all existence, you can no longer live as if you didn't know. It's not that life becomes easy or that all problems disappear. It's that someone walks with you who knows the way, who has promised not to abandon you, and who keeps his promises in ways that sometimes take years to fully reveal themselves, but that never, ever fail to materialize for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear.